25. As she headed down the steps, at first Melisende wished she'd brought a lantern, for if this place was anything like the cellars back home, she would be standing in the pitch dark within a few yards of the bottom of the stairs. But this cave was no cellar, for it seemed that the thieves had left the lantern burning when they'd left. Did that mean they had left a guard with it? Fear almost drove her back up the steps to the surface, but she dared not show cowardice in front of the woodcutter. Especially as he walked in front of her, so he would bear the brunt of any attack. If anything, the cave brightened the further she walked into it. Yet the light seemed to come from a dozen different places, all up near the ceiling. When she held her hand up near one, she was surprised to feel a draft creeping down her fingers. She marveled at the thought that air and light could come from the surface that were invisible to those who walked above. If anyone had known such a wondrous cavern lay beneath, they surely would have tried to find a way inside. Can you believe it? Mithra stood with his arms outspread, his eyes wide with wonder. Melisende smiled, biting back a comment that the cellars in Doralium were evidently much smaller than those back home. Instead, she scanned the underground chamber, searching for her things. Finally, she glimpsed the colored stripes, hiding beneath several other sacks that looked dull in comparison. She struggled to shove them aside, before getting her hands on the striped sack and pulling it from beneath its drab fellows. It was heavier than she remembered, likely full of things looted from the battlefield bodies. Having no desire for stolen treasures, Melisende upended her bag on the stone floor. Coins cascaded out, copper, silver, and more gold than she remembered possessing at the beginning of her journey. Jewel daggers and brooches made up the rest, with no sign of her spare clothes or her sword. Her stomach growled, a reminder of what else was missing. Oh, that vile thief! She poured through the tinkling hoard, but still she didn't find what she sought. Instead she swore. What is the matter? Mithra asked. That ill-begotten whoreson stole my cheese. Mithra burst out laughing. Truly, I have never heard a woman use language so colorful. And what do you care for some old cheese? There is enough gold here to buy you a lifetime's worth of cheese, and all the cheese your children could ever want to. Melisende blinked. She rose from her crouch and surveyed the room properly for the first time. As she took in what she had missed while intent on the search for her sack, her eyes grew wide. It must have taken more than one band of thieves to amass this much wealth, she said. Not even a dozen such bands in their entire lifetime. The plain sacks she'd shifted had started to spill out their contents. Each held a fortune in gold and jewels. Yet they were stacked higher than her head and wider than her arms could reach. Gold statues gleamed in the far corner, looking at first like men, until she looked more closely and realized they bore the heads of beasts. Chests and jars and barrels, stacked a dozen deep, reached almost to the ceiling of the cavern. On all sides, she saw the wealth of more than a dozen kings' treasuries, with dozens more hiding in the shadows. Melisende pressed her lips together. I don't care where they got it. I don't care how many years they've been collecting it. They stole my things, and as I can't take them back, I shall fill the bag they stole from me with their gold, to pay for what they took. She began picking up the coins from the pile on the floor, flicking aside the jewels. She was no grave robber. When she was done with the gold, she started on the silver. In payment for the cheese, she said. Then the coppers. For my loaf of bread and my cloak. When there were no more coins on the floor, she tied the sack shut and rose, throwing it over her shoulder. The gold should pay for my passage home, with a little left over for a bath and a meal and a night in a real bed in your city's best inn. If you can recommend one, I would be grateful, she said. Once again, she found Mithra staring at her. All this wealth does not belong to anyone. You said it yourself, these thieves stole it. With just a small part of this, you could live comfortably without having to work another day of your life. He shook his head. And yet you take one bag and copper coins for bread? It was Melisende's turn to stare. No amount of money could stop her from having to work every day of her life. Not for money or reward, but because it was expected of her. A woman in her position had the responsibility of looking after the people on her father's, or her husband's, estate. Hours spent in the stillroom, drying herbs or preparing medicines. Hours more seeing to the sick, and bringing charity to those who needed it. Her father's horse herds and the tithes from their tenants bought them everything they needed, but no amount of money could buy good health. That took time and care and more than a little love. Yet this man from a faraway land knew nothing of her life at home. She did not know where to start, to even try to make him understand. "What would you do with it then?" she challenged. His eyes gleamed in the darkness. "I would buy a house for my father and mother, so they need not ever pay rent again to a greedy landlord. I would pay the food merchants in the marketplace to deliver provisions to their house every week, so that they would never have to go hungry again. I would tell the inn where my mother works to hire a new cook, so that the only people my mother would cook for, and then only if she wishes it, would be my father and me. If she did not want to cook any more, I would hire a woman to do it for her. Or a girl she might train as her apprentice, perhaps. I would pay for 2 orphaned boys to be my father's apprentices, to help him cut and fetch firewood until they were old enough to do the job on their own, so that my father need no longer work. I would go to all the merchants my master traded with, and start doing business with them once again. I would take apprentices of my own, bright poor boys, or those with no parents, and no hope of someone paying for them to have an apprenticeship, so that they might learn the trade as I did. If it were possible, I would pay every soldier in that army up there to desert their general and go home, never to take up arms again. And I would travel to Rialto to see my master's family, to tell them what happened to Simon and Peter and the others, and give them what gold I managed to salvage before the army stole all their worldly goods." Mithra took a deep breath, then let it out slowly, as if he had so many things in his mind, he had to pause to decide what to say next. "Then you should take it," she said. "But if those soldiers are anything like the crusading army I marched with, no amount of coin given them will ever be enough. They wish to take and conquer, and they will not stop, not even if God himself commanded it. So do all the good you can, but I pray, do not give a single copper coin to those soldiers. Or the Crusaders, if they ever return. Hide it until they are gone, and use the money to repair the damage they have done." She closed her eyes. "All I ask is that you help me buy passage home." Mithra nodded gravely. "You have saved my life. I can refuse you nothing. I will do everything in my power to help you find hospitality in my city, and, after that, a way home." His words were spoken like an oath, and she believed them. "I will go now and return in the morning," he said. "Here, take this." He held out a small pouch that had been fastened to his belt. "It was to be my midday meal. I'm sure it is poor fare for a lady such as yourself, and I will see that you have better when you enter the city, but I hope it may tide you over until I can find a way to sneak you past the army camp without being captured." He took a bag of coins on his way out, hiding it under a load of fresh-cut wood Melisende helped him stack on his handcart before he left. Wrapped in a cloak she'd borrowed from the cavern, Melisende curled up in a tree with broad enough branches to cradle her body safely, and settled in for what she hoped would be her last night sleeping outside. 26. Grabbing a handful of coins from the bag before stashing it beneath a pile of firewood, Mithra headed first for the market. If Lady Melisende meant to enter the city, she would need to look like a local woman. There was a merchant who sold second-hand clothes which might be suitable. He picked the first 3 gowns he saw, all the sort of thing his mother might wear, and added a couple of veils. He debated whether to buy some sort of underdress too, but just the thought of Lady Melisende wearing nothing more than one of those thin, filmy things made him blush, so he decided against it. Let her buy her own underthings, for she had no shortage of coin. The thing was to get her into the city. Ah, but she'd wanted a cloak too, he remembered. He found one that was the same shade of green as her eyes, and added that to his pile. The merchant who owned the shop never took his eyes off Mithra for a moment, as though he expected him to try to steal his shabby stock. Mithra wanted to tell the man that he could afford to take Lady Melisende to the silk merchant at the other end of the bazaar, but he restrained himself. He'd pay for his purchases, then go and see if the inn up in the merchant's quarter had any rooms free. "How much?" Mithra asked, reaching into his money pouch. The merchant lifted each item, eyed it for a long moment, before setting it down and going to the next, as though he hadn't watched Mithra select every one. Finally, he rested one hand on the pile of clothes and stretched out the other, palm up. 50 coppers, he said loftily. Mithra thought it sounded a little high, but then he'd never bought women's clothing before. He didn't have time to haggle. He took out a coin and set it on the table. The merchant's eyes grew wide. He snatched up the coin, then bit it. Too late, Mithra realized he'd pulled out gold instead of silver. He dug through his pouch and pulled out a handful of copper. "Here." "Thief! A lowly laborer like you could not come upon gold like this honestly. I knew you were a thief the moment I saw you. Guard. Instead of a guard, the merchant had managed to get the attention of a pair of soldiers, who hurried over. Mithra swore, threw the coins back into his pouch and bolted. At first he ran through the middle of the market, dodging between people until he found the alley he wanted. He dived for the narrow gap between one shop and another, then headed into the maze of alleys and back passages that only a boy who'd grown up in the bazaar truly knew. The soldiers lost him in seconds, and by the time he emerged from the side door of Simon's old shop, wearing the set of clean clothes he'd kept there when he worked in the shop, they were nowhere in sight. Holding his head proudly like the merchant he'd once hoped to become, he headed for the inn. The tap room was almost empty, but for two soldiers who eyed him suspiciously when he entered. "Are you new to the city?" one of them asked. They both had their hands on their swords, as if waiting for him to deliver a less than favorable answer. "No, I was born here," Mithra said easily. "I worked in one of the shops a few doors down, until we had to close because we'd run out of goods to sell. I'm expecting a new shipment of silk and spices from the east soon, and I wanted to see if there would be any rooms free for the caravan master when he arrives." "All the rooms are free," said the innkeeper, with a surly glance at the soldiers. "We've had no new guests since the army arrived, and all the old ones left. Your friend will be assured of the best room in the house. As long as he doesn't mind answering a lot of questions from these men first." Mithra's heart sank. If Lady Melisende came here, the soldiers would capture her for sure. He managed to smile. "I shall tell him when he arrives." It was the same at the next inn and the next, right down to the cheap one by the gates where his mother worked. Darkness was falling and he had no clothes for Melisende and nowhere for her to sleep. Perhaps his aunt might have some old clothes that Melisende might be able to wear. Praying his luck would change, Mithra headed for his uncle's house. To his surprise, Aunt Sada answered the door. "What happened to the maid?" Mithra asked. Sada frowned. "The girl ran away. I don't know what's the trouble with these modern girls, not wanting to do good honest work. One night she was here and the next morning gone. Now I need a new one and I don't know where to find one. I don't suppose you know of any girls where you live who are good workers?" Most of the girls where Mithra lived were all good workers, spending every hour of the day working at whatever jobs they already had, if they weren't taking care of their family. Sometimes, like his mother, they did both. None of them were in need of another job. "If I do, I shall send her straight to you, dear aunt," Mithra promised. She smiled. "You always were a good boy. If only Kasim and I could have had a son like you. My mother sent me to ask if you have any old clothes you no longer need. There are a couple of poor widows near us who are dependent on the kindness of the city, as they have no family to care for them." Sada nodded. Of course. Perhaps you can help me lift the lids on the chests, for I have no maid to do it for me now." Mithra dutifully followed his aunt inside and helped her search through her clothes until he had an armful of things that might fit Melisende. "Oh, and there are these things of Cassim's which no longer fit him. I fear he's grown quite stout, and I've had to order new tunics from the tailors for him. A new belt too, for he cannot fasten the old one. It's still quite fine. I'm sure it would fit you." His aunt would not let him go until he'd at least fastened the new belt around his waist, and then she fussed about him, shifting things from his old belt to the new one. He reached for his coin pouch at the same time as she did, spilling the contents everywhere. Crusader whispered a gentle oath, not the sort that burned his ears like Melisende's, and knelt to help him collect the coins. When he had everything back where it belonged, Mithra thanked his aunt, bundled up the clothes into an old sack, and headed home. Now night had fallen, he saw more soldiers in the streets, but he just bowed his head, like any tired laborer at the end of a long day, and they mostly ignored him. Lady Melisende had no hope of hiding in Doralium with all these soldiers around. They would know her for a Crusader maiden in a moment. But if they thought she was a lowly servant, someone beneath their notice, she might have a chance. An idea began to form in the back of his mind. By morning he hoped to have the whole scheme thought out, before he presented it to Melisende and prayed she would agree to it. 27. "I don't believe a simple change of clothes will convince them I'm not a Crusader," Melisende said, looking down at the shapeless dress with distaste. "Says the Crusader maiden who made an entire army think she was a boy for the march here," Mithra returned. That made her pause. Are people really so silly that they only see what is on the surface? It was a sobering thought, and a saddening one. People see what they expect to see. Soldiers expected to see a boy in armor marching with them, and so that's what they saw. The Doralium guards expect to see a modestly clad woman, escorted by her husband or brother or whoever, as do the Seljuk soldiers. If you wear this, they will take one look and dismiss you as beneath their notice. Men always notice women. Sometimes they try to hide it, but trust me, we know when we are being watched. Mithra blushed. "I only glanced over my shoulder to see if you were finished dressing. When I realized you were not, I turned my back again." Melisende's mouth dropped open in surprise. More at his honesty than his admission. She gave herself a mental shake, telling herself he couldn't have seen much more than her bare back, for she'd turned her back on him too, and, oh, what did it matter anyway? She'd be headed home soon, and she'd never see this woodcutter again. "Let's go," he said, giving his handcart a push. Panic rose up in her throat, but she forced it down. If Mithra had wanted to betray her to the soldiers, he'd have done so yesterday, without coming back and bringing her these scratchy clothes. With her hair covered by one veil and another that hid most of her face, there was nothing for the soldiers to see except a walking sack. She felt like a leper. She glanced nervously at the army camp as they stepped out of the shadow of the forest. If they caught her, they certainly wouldn't treat her like a leper. Lecherous soldiers couldn't keep their hands off the women they had caught. Not to mention wearing what felt like a tent that ballooned around her while she walked, would make it harder to run if she had to. Even with her magic, could she reach the cover of the trees? "Keep your eyes on the ground. Pretend you're so painfully shy that you can't bear to see someone looking at you. Hunch your shoulders a little and bow your head, like you're afraid of being beaten. Don't look around, don't stare, and definitely don't meet anyone's gaze." She aimed a glare at the back of his head, before doing as he commanded. If her brothers could see her now, they would laugh so hard they pissed themselves. She bowed her head to no one, and to do it now on the orders of some foreign peasant, if her life did not depend on it, she wasn't sure she could bear it. It took an eternity to cross the battlefield, even with the bodies gone. She didn't dare wonder where they'd gone. Finally they slowed as they reached the gates. "Good evening," Mithra said. The guards returned his greeting and they exchanged pleasantries for a moment until someone said, "Who's the girl?" A tug on her sleeve made her shuffle closer to the handcart. She relaxed a little when she realized it was Mithra, then tensed again under the guard's sudden scrutiny. "This is my betrothed, Melis. She came to find me to invite me to dinner with her family, and she was afraid to walk back through the forest on her own, so she waited to walk with me." One of the guards sniggered while the other laughed aloud. "Oh, it's called walking now, is it?" Mithra lifted his shoulders in a shrug. "Well, our families won't let us wed yet, what with the war and all, and we've been waiting so long. What else is a man to do but go for a walk in the woods?" More laughter as the guards waved them through, wishing him a hasty wedding. Melisende's face burned. If she met anyone's eyes now, they'd see her mortification. Much safer to keep her gaze firmly on the ground. When they were far enough away from the gate for no one to hear, she hissed, "Damn your impertinent hide, Mithra. Now everyone thinks I am your whore. I should strike you down for that. Were my brothers here, they would cut out your lying tongue." Mithra kept his voice low. "No, they do not. Those two guards believe you are my betrothed, soon to be my obedient bride. From the moment I told them you were mine, they averted their eyes and looked only at me. They think we fornicated in the forest," she persisted. "Would you rather they knew the truth?" "No, for it would mean her death, and likely his as well." "Take me to the inn. I want to wash," she snapped. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Come with me while I take my cart home, and then I shall take you to where you can stay." She followed him to the door of what she might have called a tiny cottage, with a roof made of thatch and not stone. He tucked the handcart into a corner of the yard, then led the way down a new street. The hovels on either side did not give the air of a prosperous place to stay. "Are you sure the best inn is this way?" she demanded. Mithra sighed. "Indeed it is, but I cannot take you there, nor to any other inn in the city, for there are soldiers waiting at all of them to put any newcomer to the question. A woman traveling alone is unusual enough, but one who arrives now, when there are no travelers left in the city, you would be caught and questioned for certain. So in the absence of a suitable inn, I have found somewhere you might stay without suspicion until the army departs, and you can seek passage home." They passed several soldiers along the way, some of whom appeared to be patrolling, while others seemed to be looking for some off-duty entertainment. She had to wait until the soldiers were far enough away before she said tartly, "It had better not be a brothel. Though you swear like one of their best customers, no, I would not dream of taking you to such a place." Somewhat satisfied, she followed him through the poor district, and into one that looked more prosperous. "This is more like it," she said, looking at the larger houses with satisfaction. Mithra chose one and rapped smartly at the door. A well-dressed woman wearing a veil much like Melisende's answered it. "Good evening, nephew." "Aunt Sada, this is Melis, the maid you wanted. She is formerly from a Crusader household, so she might not be as familiar with our ways, but she is capable and a quick learner. If you can give her somewhere suitable to sleep, she will serve you well." Melisende did not have more than a moment to collect her wits before the woman had grabbed her arm and dragged her inside, closing the door on Mithra's only mildly apologetic countenance. "A maid? Truly?" And shortening her name so it sounded like malice. Perhaps she should have let the thieves kill him after all. 28. When Mithra reached home, he found both his parents waiting for him, with a familiar sack on the table between them. "Mother," he said with surprise. "Does no one at the gatehouse want supper tonight? I can't remember the last time you came home so early." "No one at the gatehouse wants a cook tonight, or any other night," Mother said. "With few visitors to the city and people scared to go out after dark on account of all the soldiers in the streets, the innkeeper's wife will do all their cooking from now on. I thought perhaps I could help you and your father, at least until there are travelers on the roads again, but when I went into the storeroom to fetch the handcart, I found this." She pointed at the sack. His father took up the tale. "When I arrived home, your mother asked me about it, but I'd never seen it before. I certainly hadn't put it there, or carefully hidden it beneath a pile of fresh-cut firewood. And when we opened it," he tipped it up and gold cascaded across the table. "I know you sold Simon's goods and keep the money you made from them in a chest, but the dust atop it tells me you haven't touched that in weeks, and even if you sold every item in his warehouses, you could not have amassed so much gold. If it were filled with coppers maybe, or even a few silver coins, but gold, this is a king's ransom here. Tell me, did you steal the Seljuk army's war chest?" He wished he had, for without money surely the soldiers would have to go home. But Mithra did not dare lie to his parents. "I was cutting wood in the forest yesterday," he began. He told them everything about the thieves, their magic cave, and all it contained. The only detail he left out was any mention of Lady Melisende. Though she likely wouldn't forgive him for making her work as his aunt's maid, she definitely would not forgive him if she shared her secrets. When Mithra had finished his tale, his father said, "My son, you have done a terrible thing. While there is little crime in stealing from a thief, the 40 Thieves are known for their ruthless methods and the power of their vengeance. If they find out you have taken what belongs to them, they will hunt you to the very ends of the earth, kill you, and slaughter everyone you have ever known or loved. To protect us from their wrath, we must bury the gold deep in the garden, and no one must ever know we have it." In vain did Mithra argue that the coin could be spent in such a way, without revealing the source of their wealth, but his parents would hear none of it. On the morrow both he and his father went out to cut wood again, for all the world as if nothing had changed. And for a time it seemed that little had. But not for long. 29. To her surprise, Melisende found that being Sader's maid was not so onerous a job as it seemed. The thin pallet she was expected to sleep on was as uncomfortable as any of the nights she'd spent sleeping on the ground near Zoticus, but her duties seemed to consist solely of fetching and carrying things for either the cook or Sader herself. Back at home, as mistress of the stillroom and succorer of the sick, she'd been far busier. While she stayed inside the house, she wasn't expected to wear the heavy veil she'd donned to get through the gates, and the cook seemed resigned to having to explain even the simplest task to her. Apparently, the woman had trained a great many maids. Every day, she was expected to sweep the steps, and she took a moment to ascertain whether there were soldiers still patrolling the streets, or whether she might leave. Every day, she found them still there, so when she was finished, she headed back inside again, to fetch some meat for the cook, or to find the slippers Sader had lost since putting them down only a moment ago. One day melted into the next, and she was surprised to discover she'd been a servant for more than 2 weeks, before she met the master of the house, who'd been traveling to another town to see what had become of a shipment of trade goods which had not yet arrived. He was a great, lumpy jelly of a man, with greedy eyes that matched his girth. His gaze touched on everything and made her feel like scrubbing. He had a manservant who served his dinner, but the cook still expected her to carry the platters to the table, and Melisende felt his eyes on her every time she entered the room. She was glad when the cook let her retire as soon as she'd brought in dessert, for with Master Kassem home, the evening meal would end quite late and it was better to wash the dishes in the morning when they'd had time to soak. Only that morning she'd discovered a plentiful supply of straw in the hayloft above the stables, and after several trips from the loft to her tiny bedchamber, she now had a bed even her brothers would envy. She fell asleep almost instantly, only to wake in the dark with her heart pounding and no reason for it that she could see. Then she heard heavy breathing when she knew she was holding her breath. She was up and out of bed in an instant, trying to escape from her tiny room, but a solid shadow blocked the doorway. A shadow that shoved her up against the wall. "Take those clothes off, girl," a male voice said. A draft chilled her legs as she realized he'd seized hold of the hem of her gown and was trying to haul it up over her head. "Go to hell," she snarled, tearing out of his grasp. Then his full weight hit her, knocking her to the floor. He forced his lips against hers in a slobbery kiss that made her retch. She bit him. He howled and lashed out at her, but she smashed her knee into his groin and fought her way free before any of his blows landed. Then she bit her own lip, and magic seemed to infuse the air around her. She moved while it did not. "Come back here, girl. I am the master of this house, and you will obey me," Kasim roared. "Touch me again and I'll cut off your wizened little prick, and shove it so far up your ass all you'll taste for the next month will be your own balls," Melisende hissed, drawing her dagger. He staggered to his feet, blundering past her in the dark toward his own chamber. She breathed a sigh of relief and sheathed her dagger. "I'll be back with my belt, and when I do you'll learn obedience, bitch," Kasim shouted. "Not bloody likely." She paused only to pull on her boots and grab her cloak to cover herself before she raced out into the street. She wasn't sure where she was headed, but anywhere was better than here. 30. Melisende stopped to catch her breath, and discovered she'd run clean across town to Mithra's house. She found him asleep in a loft above the storerooms, so she shook him awake. Before he had time to speak, she said, "Did you know that your uncle is a lecherous toad who deserves to burn in hell for all eternity for trying to use his servants like whores?" Mithra managed to sit up. "I had heard that he beat some of his servants, but I never imagined the beatings were anything but deserved. From what my aunt said, Crusader is a simpering fool who spends her days making clothes for the children she'll never have because her husband is too busy forcing himself on his servants in their own beds to spend any time in hers. Well, we did suspect there was no love between them and he only married her for her father's money, but Crusader is the only person I knew who would take you in without asking questions, even if it meant you had to pretend to be her maid for a few days. I'd hoped the army might leave before now, but they seem determined to stay. I'm as trapped as you, Melisende. I don't know what else to do." She forced her hands down by her sides, in an effort to resist shaking Mithra again. Perhaps he truly didn't know what a villain his uncle was, or he hadn't until now. Crusader's house had been a suitable place to hide, if Kasim hadn't come home. "Perhaps if I talk to my uncle." She cut him off. "I talked to him. I told him I'd cut off his manhood if he ever touched me again. He went off in search of something to beat me with, or at least that's what I think he was shouting about. I don't know. That's when I left to come here." "Right. All right." Mithra rubbed his face with his hands. "It is most certainly not all right. No, but I don't know what else I can do. If you stay here, my parents would soon find out about you, which means the rest of the street would know within the week, and someone would sell you to the soldiers sooner than that. The only safe place for you is Crusader's house. If you can stay away from my uncle." "He came to my bed." "Is there anywhere else you might sleep? Their house is much bigger than ours. Perhaps in the stables." Melisende wanted to slap him if her father knew she had to sleep in a stable, but her father wouldn't be pleased with her sleeping anywhere but her chamber at home. Grudgingly she offered, "There is a hayloft above the stables which you can only reach by a ladder, which I could pull up after me. I doubt he'd find me there." "Then that is what you must do. I'm sorry, Lady Melisende, that I cannot offer you better accommodations, but I am merely a woodcutter, and what you see here is how I live. If it were safe to enter any of the inns, I would take you to one at once, but the soldiers, I'm trying to keep you safe in the only way I can. If only the angels had sent you a better protector. One of their own, or a knight maybe, but I am merely me. Forgive me." Now she regretted her outburst. What man in her village at home, let alone a woodcutter, would offer her such assistance, if they'd found her in the woods alone? He'd done nothing but help her in any way he could. His uncle might be a piece of filth, but Mithra was a good man. There is nothing to forgive, she said. On a whim, she kissed his cheek. For a moment she thought a spark had passed between them, but surely she had imagined it. I will go and ascend to my new hayloft bedchamber. He took a deep breath. If you wish, I could come with you and stand guard while you sleep. She'd never wanted a man in her bedchamber, but if she was to trust any man in it, it would be Mithra. I would like. A thunderous hammering came from the front door. Ali Baba, I know you are home. Open the door this instant. It's him. Mithra hissed. I don't know what he's doing here, but if he finds you, go, Melisende, go. I will keep him here for as long as I can, so that you are safe in your eyrie when he returns. Once again, Melisende bolted, but more than once, she caught herself glancing behind to see if he was following. No, not Kasim. Instead, she hoped for Mithra. 31. By the time Mithra reached the front door, he found not only had his father opened it, but Kasim had already bulled his way inside. After feeling the full force of Melisende's fury, Mithra was more than ready to fight the man himself. His father knew nothing of Melisende or what had transpired in Kasim's house tonight, so it seemed safest to be civil. To start with, at least. Good evening, uncle, Mithra said. Is there some urgent matter that you wish father's help with, that you must visit so late? Uncle Kasim's eyes narrowed. Yes, most urgent. You did not seem to think so. We are family. I allow you to live in this house at so low a rent it is positively criminal, yet when the tables are turned, I find you are not willing to share your good fortune with me. Mithra and his father exchanged confused glances. This had nothing to do with Melisende, so even Mithra had no idea what the man meant. My most esteemed brother, Ali Baba began. Have you perhaps drunk a little too much wine? My wife has recently lost her position as gatehouse cook, but I would hardly consider that good fortune. Kasim's brows lowered until they almost met over his hawk-like nose. Pa! What do I care about your wife or the pennies they pay her? Not when you possess gold so plentiful you did not even notice that these were missing. He pulled something out of the pouch at his waist and tossed it at the table. The coins flew across the surface before tinkling to the floor. Ali Baba bent to retrieve them. When he raised his head above the table, his expression had turned from confusion to dread. Carefully, he laid the 3 gold coins on the table. Do not lie to me, brother. Your son dropped these at my house weeks ago and only found them tonight. Where are the rest? Kasim demanded. Ali Baba closed his eyes. I will show you. He rose. Mithra was faster. No. I shall. I found them in a cave in the forest when I was out cutting wood. Aha! Kasim turned to his brother. Did you think you could keep such wealth to yourself? Are we not brothers who share everything? If Kasim's words were true, then he would have invited them to live with him in the merchant's quarter, instead of charging them what was actually quite a normal rate of rent for a cottage here. I'll take you now if you like, Mithra offered. Kasim's eyes gleamed with even more greed than usual. Not without bringing some beasts to carry the treasure home. What is to stop you from stealing it the moment I am gone and hiding it somewhere else? No, I shall take my share now. Wait right here while I go get some horses. Mithra started in panic. If Kasim went to his stables and found Melisende. No, not horses. What you want is mules. Sturdy beasts who are used to carrying great weights. If you mean to carry your half of the treasure away with you, you will need as many mules as you can find. Kasim nodded thoughtfully. You see, brother? Your son knows the value of family if you do not. Perhaps I shall make him my heir if my barren wife does not bother to give me a son." Mithra had no desire for anything his uncle had touched, but he was not a fool either. With or without the thieves' gold, inheriting his uncle's business at some point in the future could not be a bad thing. "Thank you, uncle. I will wait here while you get the mules." Wearing a grin so wide he truly resembled the toad Melisende had called him, Kasim dashed out into the darkness. 32. It was nearly noon by the time Mithra and his uncle reached the cave. They'd started out shortly after dawn, but Kasim had insisted upon far too many mules, all roped together. Even with Mithra at the front and Kasim bringing up the rear, the animals managed to tangle the ropes in trees more than a dozen times before they had traveled a mile. Then his uncle started complaining about the heat and the distance, followed by how ungrateful Mithra and his whole family were. At this point, Mithra was more than ready to leave his uncle in the woods to find his way out on his own. But he was family, and there was more wealth in the cave than Mithra and his family could ever use, so he did not see a problem sharing it with his uncle. Before they'd left, his father had warned him to be careful, and Mithra meant to be. So when he finally reached the clearing and ascertained that it was empty, Mithra finally dared to breathe a sigh of relief. "I don't see a cave. Where is this magical place?" Kasim complained. Mithra merely walked over to the boulder and said, "Open sesame." Just as before, the cavern opened. "After you, uncle," Mithra said with a bow. For a moment Kasim looked suspicious, before he peered down the steps. He must have caught the glitter of gold or something else that changed his mind, for he trotted down the first few steps, before turning to block Mithra's path. "You stay up here and mind the mules," he said. "I shall choose what treasure to take as my share, and you may have the rest." Mithra shrugged. If his father had his way, their share would be nothing at all, at least until they had run out of the gold he'd already brought home. Seeing as he hadn't spent anything yet, that could take quite some time. Deciding that his uncle would probably be a while, and that the man would shout if he needed him, Mithra tied the lead mule's rope to a tree and found a suitable bush to shade him while he caught up on some much-needed sleep. Mithra woke some time later to angry shouts. At first he thought they'd come from his uncle, until he realized that he'd heard several voices shouting at once, and his uncle's was not one of them. Carefully, Mithra rose up onto his knees and peered between the branches. His worst fears were realized. A large number of men occupied the clearing with the mules, and they were most unhappy at having to share. "Look! Someone has moved the stone." One thief pointed, but they all turned to look. Mithra's heart sank. He had to warn his uncle, but he didn't know how. He could not reach the cave without running through the thieves, who would surely kill him on sight. His only hope was that his uncle had heard them, and that he'd found somewhere inside the cave to hide until the thieves had left. So Mithra held his breath and waited. The thieves approached the cave entrance, their steps stealthy and their swords drawn. Down the steps they went, two at a time, sealing the entrance behind them. When Mithra was certain that all 40 of them had gone in, only then did he dare move. He raced across the clearing and climbed the tree where he and Melisende had sat when they'd first learned the secrets of the cave. He waited and he waited until finally, the boulder moved and the thieves emerged. Mithra counted 40 men, with no sign of his uncle among them. "That will serve as a lesson to anyone who thinks to steal from us," the leader said. "Untie the mules. We shall sell them to recover the cost of what has already been stolen from us." His men took the mules and departed. Mithra stayed in his tree, waiting until he was certain they had all gone. Then he waited a little more, until the sun seemed ready to sink beneath the horizon. He wished he could go home, get his father, and together they could find out what had happened to his uncle. But Mithra was a man, not a frightened child, which is what he knew his father would say. Besides, his uncle might still be alive. With that heartening thought, Mithra told the stone to shift aside. He descended into the gloom, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim twilight as he called softly, "Uncle? Uncle Kasim? It's me, Mithra. They've gone, it's safe to come out." He waited a moment, then repeated the words several times, but still he got no answer. He stepped off the bottom step and trod in something soft. Mithra glanced down, then recoiled in horror. Beneath his boot was a hand that ended in a bloody stump where the wrist should be. Another hand lay several yards away, with 2 arms and a torso in pieces between them. The legs and feet were off to the right, while his uncle's head had rolled almost to the wall on his left. Mithra fought not to lose what little he'd eaten that morning. He wasn't sure what he'd expected to find, but his uncle's dismembered body was not it. What would he tell his father? Or his aunt? Not wanting to leave his uncle's remains there, Mithra bundled the pieces into a bale of cloth, wrapping the winding sheet around them until he was sure he had them all secure. Then he forced the grisly bundle into the biggest sack he could find, and began the long journey home. 33. When he finally reached home, it was past sunset and the lamps had been lit. Mithra paused at the door, trying to decide where to take his uncle's body. He caught the sound of feminine voices inside, and thanked whatever watchful angel had slowed his steps. If his mother had a visitor, he couldn't bring the body inside. He laid the sack on his handcart instead, gathering up an armload of firewood to lay over it to conceal it. "Mithra, is that you?" his father asked. Shuffling footsteps sounded, before his father was silhouetted in the doorway. "Where is Kasim?" Sada arrived just before sundown, hysterical with worry that she hadn't seen him since he left last night. "Your mother is trying to calm her down, for if Kasim were to see her like this, he would beat her." Mithra knew with a certainty he would not have possessed if it wasn't for Melisende's story last night. But his father had known. Though he hated to even think it, Mithra suspected his uncle might have deserved his fate. "Uncle Kasim is dead. Killed by the thieves, who happened upon us while Uncle was collecting treasure from the cave. I managed to hide, but Uncle—" he gestured toward the sack. "They chopped his body into pieces. I could not leave him there. What should I do now?" Mithra had spent years learning the trade of both a merchant and a woodcutter, but neither had prepared him for a situation like this. Surely his father would know. His father stood in thoughtful silence for a moment, then said, "You must take him home. Put his body in the cellar or somewhere cool, and see that he is laid out for his funeral. I will keep your aunt here for as long as I can, to give you time to do what you must. See that her maid has a sleeping draught ready for her when she arrives, if you need more time." Melisende. Melisende would help, and hopefully know what to do. She'd been a healer. Did that mean she'd had to lay out bodies for funerals before? Because no healer could save everyone. Mithra found himself nodding, lifting up the handles of his handcart to deliver Kasim home for the last time. He trudged through the streets with his cart, forcing his voice to sound cheerful as he told every soldier he met how he was on his last firewood delivery of the night. None of them seemed to care, or feel the need to shift the thin layer of branches camouflaging Kasim's remains. Mithra reached Kasim's door and knocked softly. He knew the angels had answered his prayer when Melisende opened it. Mithra's breath whooshed out of him in a great gust of relief. He'd never been so glad to see anyone in his life. "Help me with this," he said, pushing the barrow toward the cellar entrance. Hesitantly, Melisende followed. "Close the door," he said, seizing the firewood and stacking it with the rest. That left only the sack on the handcart, which he could not seem to bring himself to open. Melisende didn't share his qualms. She strode across the cellar and reached for the fastening. "What's in here?" All his life, he'd been brought up to believe women should be sheltered, not subjected to a man's life of blood and toil. Especially high-born ones like her. His instinct screamed at him to be silent. But if he didn't tell her, she'd find out for herself, and she deserved a warning before having Kassim's blood on her hands. It's Kassim. Hacked up into little pieces and bundled into a sack. He waited for her to faint or scream or some such ladylike thing that Crusader would definitely have done. Melisende blinked. That is, very kind of you, but you didn't need to kill him for me. Ah, thank you, I suppose. I only threatened to cut off his manhood. Not everything. But if this is how such things are done here, I guess I should be grateful. At home, this would be considered murder and you'd be in trouble for it. Are things so different out here in the desert? Mithra's breath caught in his throat. She thought he'd brought his uncle's body as a gift. A laugh burst out of him, the sound startling her as much as him. It took him a moment to get himself under control enough to speak. I didn't kill him. The 40 Thieves did. You see? Mithra spilled out the whole story, not leaving out anything, including his own cowardice. Melisende's eyes widened. They'll come here next. If what you said is true, they'll find out who he is and come after his family. We'll have to hide his death long enough to make it look like something else. Some sort of sickness maybe, so no one suspects, but Crusader is still out looking for him. I'll tell her, I found him in the cellar unconscious and wounded after he fell down the stairs and that I've made up a sickbed for him there, so that I might tend to his wounds. Infection that proceeds to necrosis, I'll go to the apothecary for medicine in the morning and keep returning to say he is worse until the blood poisoning could reasonably kill him. Fastest would be a gut wound, which would take less than a week. Hence the need to mention necrosis and a wound, to account for the smell at the funeral. She gave a little nod. That should work. Mithra could not help staring. You thought all that up right then? Melisende shrugged. Mostly. It's only a rough plan. It will surely need more thought if it's to work. Would your family visit if your uncle is sick? At his nod she continued, then you must definitely visit every day and see that everyone you meet knows of Kassim's illness. You say your father knows, so only you and he should come down to the cellar to see Kassim. I will try to stitch the body together as best I can, then cover it with a sheet, so that at least to anyone who looks into the cellar, he will appear to be a sick man instead of a dead one. And buy some herbs to burn to cover the smell. Mithra nodded, trying to commit all the details to memory, so that he might help her in any way he could. He didn't know what he'd do without her. 34. Melisende was surprised at how smoothly her plan went. She dealt with one or two cases like the one she'd described to Mithra, so it was easy to state the right symptoms to the apothecary. She'd stitched the mostly bloodless body together, then bandaged it tightly and bundled it into some of Kassim's clothes. The bloodied rags and sack Mithra had brought the body in were burned with some of Mithra's firewood, leaving no sign of what had really happened to Kassim. Dealing with Crusader was another matter. At first she'd insisted on seeing her husband, saying it was her duty as a good wife, but she'd gagged at the smell from the stairs and scuttled out again. By the end of the day, Melisende had her convinced that sending her maid to nurse the man was more than anyone would expect of a good wife. Perhaps if Kassim had been a better husband or done something to deserve his wife's love, it might not have been so easy, but as it was. Mithra and his family came every day, spending long hours with Crusader. Mithra escaped to find Melisende as often as he dared, meeting her in the stables so they could get away from the ghastly smell in the cellar. Melisende brought a selection of food from the kitchen, which they shared, while they told each other tales about their lives before the crusade. For the first time in her life, she told someone what it felt like to use her magic to run with horses or to travel swiftly when someone's life depended on it. For Mithra had seen how fast she could run when she'd used her momentum against him, and there was no point in pretending it was a secret between them. He in turn told her about Peter and Simon and the family he'd spent his apprenticeship with. Several times he'd started to say how much she'd like Peter but stopped himself. Then a shadow would pass across his face before he changed the subject. Melisende had wanted to hug him each and every time, but if Mithra was anything like her brothers, he'd only push her and her girlish sentimentality away. Then again, none of her brothers had ever lost their best friend in what Mithra said had been a particularly brutal murder. But their idyll soon came to an end, when Melisende had to go to the apothecary to buy a sleeping draught to help calm Cassim's newly widowed wife. Crusader was not allowed to attend her own husband's funeral, Melisende learned, for that was a men's affair alone. Mithra and Ali Baba had stayed for long enough to leave Mithra's mother, Banu, to comfort the grieving widow, before they departed with Cassim's coffin. Then the women, Crusader's friends, started to arrive. Melisende was run off her feet, fetching things from the kitchen to feed the hungry hordes. Banu, a cook herself, if Melisende remembered Mithra's words correctly, worked alongside the cook, issuing a stream of orders that Melisende hurried to obey. She hadn't worked this hard since the last Yule feast at home when her mother was still alive. But when the day was done and Melisende thought she might be able to creep up to bed, the cook sent her to clean out Cassim's bedchamber, and another across the passage that was reserved for guests, if Cassim had ever had any. "Why?" Melisende asked crossly. "Because tomorrow Cassim's heir moves into his new house and the family's rooms must be clean or they will dismiss you as a bad servant," the cook said. If they did that, they'd deserve whatever retribution the 40 thieves visited upon them, Melisende thought. But then her sluggish mind turned up another thought that wouldn't go away. But Crusader is his widow. Isn't the house hers? She'd heard Crusader say something about how she'd grown up in this house, which had belonged to her father. Of course not. She couldn't inherit, but her father had no sons, so he willed it to her husband instead. When Cassim died, everything he owned passed to his nearest male heir. Luckily for her, he's a kind man who will let her stay. "Who is he?" Melisende asked. If he was anywhere near as bad as Cassim, she wanted to be warned. Ali Baba, Mithra's father. Which meant? Mithra's moving in here? Melisende blurted out. That's the young master to you, girl. He'll be taking over his uncle's shop and all the rest of the business, so Master Mithra will be a much more important man. He won't be a woodcutter anymore. The cook headed off with a satisfied air as if she expected her orders to be obeyed. Melisende smiled. Master Mithra. Merchant Mithra. She knew how much he longed to be able to practice his trade again, and tomorrow he would finally achieve his dream. It was fitting that he slept in a fine bed in his uncle's best room. And she was in a position to provide it. Suddenly possessed of a new burst of energy, Melisende set to work. Tomorrow was going to be a good day. 35. Mithra arrived at Cassim's shop well before dawn, hoping to have time to go over the books and stock before opening the shop at the normal time later on that morning. Yet when he opened the door and raised his lantern to look inside, Mithra had to remind himself that it was not his uncle's shop anymore. It was his father had told him, and his alone. His father had expressed hope that Simon's teachings during Mithra's long apprenticeship would stand him in good stead to keep the shop as profitable as it had been under his uncle's aegis. Mithra hoped so too. Yet as he lit the lamps, far too few in his opinion, he did not feel the same confidence he had in Simon's shop. This place looked dim and dingy, which meant the goods could not catch a buyer's eye as easily as if they were brightly lit. Mithra shook his head. Never mind the lights. He could make changes on the morrow, when he had a day's trade under his belt which he could then compare to the next day's takings, to see if there had been any improvement. As Simon had often said, the numbers did not lie. But first he had to find the numbers, and Cassim's books could be anywhere. After an hour of looking, Mithra began to despair of ever finding Kasim's records in the cluttered shop. But when he turned too swiftly and tipped over a pile of brass bells that seemed to want to roll everywhere, he found a dusty bookshelf tucked under a table which contained records dating back to before Sade's father's time. Selecting the most recent volume, Mithra sat down and began to read. It took Mithra several hours to determine with any certainty how bad a businessman his uncle had been, by which time he knew he'd need to read all the records to work out just how much mess the shop was in. Mithra did not open the shop on the first day, nor the second. In fact, it was almost a full week before he dared to open the awning and allow people inside. He needn't have bothered. No one seemed to want to enter the dark space, and those who looked like they might consider it were chased away by the surly looks of the man who owned the shop next door. The same man who had accused Mithra of being a thief, when he tried to buy clothes from the man. Mithra began to realize why his uncle's business had been doing so badly. That had to change, he resolved. Kasim's shop had plenty of stock, but it was piled up haphazardly in such a way that no one could find what they wanted. Mithra had looked in vain for any record of Kasim's warehouse, where some of this clutter might be stored, only to find that he had sold it more than a year ago to some Crusader merchant who likely had no use for it now. Mithra had lost count of the number of times he'd wished he were back in Simon's well-lit, well-laid-out shop, in its prime place in the market. Mithra had no doubt if he got some of Kasim's goods to Simon's shop, they would sell so much better. In fact, Mithra took a fresh piece of parchment and began to take stock. If he used this place as his warehouse and opened up Simon's shop, Mithra might be able to actually sell something. Simon had owned his shop, and still no one seemed to have tried to take possession of it, so Mithra decided to try his luck. Before dawn the next day, he began moving a selection of stock that he thought might capture soldiers' eyes into Simon's shop. He was still arranging his wares when the other shops around him began to open, and more than one soldier had taken advantage of the open awning to come and ask Mithra if he would be opening for business again. And then came the magic words. "Because I was hoping you might have." A customer who told him exactly what he wanted was the easiest sale a merchant could make, Mithra knew. And that afternoon, he opened. By the time he closed, he had sold out of several items, including those benighted brass bells, and he lingered a little longer in the market to bring another shipment from Kasim's shop to Simon's. The next day, he did more business in a day than Kasim had in his last month. Not that he could celebrate yet. His numbers told him that he'd only achieved an average sales day for Simon's shop, with its superior position and all. He could do better than this. After several days setting up the shop differently every morning and filling it with new stock every night, Mithra made a new record. For the first time, he sold more goods in a day than Simon's shop had ever sold since the start of his apprenticeship. If there had been a merchants' guild in Doralium, they might have awarded him mastery on the spot. As it was, Mithra found himself trying out a new name in his head, testing out how it felt. Master Mithra. Master Merchant Mithra. He laughed to himself. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined this would be possible for him. Something he could thank his uncle for. No. This was Melisende's doing. If she had not arrived and shown him the thieves' cave, Kasim would be still alive, slowly running his own shop down into bankruptcy. He owed her everything. And yet she still served as a maid in his uncle's house, waiting for the army to leave so that she might go home. He shook his head. Melisende had not said a word of complaint, which surely made her an angel, his guardian angel, if such things existed. He could not give her the object of her desire just yet, but he owed her at least a gift, as a token of thanks for all she had done. He scanned the marketplace, trying to find something suitable. This was made near impossible by the fact that most of the shops, like his own, had pulled their awnings down and closed for the night. But some lanterns were still lit, including the one at the bakery where Kagri worked. She stood at the counter, serving supper to a long line of customers, while the smell of yeast from the back room told him that the bread for tomorrow was already rising. "So how can I help you?" Cagri asked, fluttering those eyelashes that used to send his heart fluttering too. But he saw no light of recognition in her eyes, and her words were hollow, when he knew that she said the same thing and looked the same way at any prosperous young man who entered her shop. How could he have ever thought her beautiful? Or imagined that he loved her? He'd been such a fool. And then he'd met Melisende, the Crusader maiden who had never heard of sesame before, or tasted a cake made of the stuff. "Do you have any sesame cakes left?" Mithra asked. They only had one, and a small one at that. When Cagri read the disappointment in his eyes, she offered all manner of other things instead, including a delivery of a whole box of cakes upon the morrow if he wished. No. One was enough. He would give it to Melisende, and watch her expression as she ate it. Most likely she would hate it, for Peter's sisters had not been fond of them, he recalled. They did not like the seeds that caught in their teeth, or some other such silliness. It mattered not. He would keep his promise to Melisende, and tell her how grateful he was for all of her assistance. They lived under the same roof, yet he had not seen her since his uncle's funeral, and that had been weeks ago. He paid for his purchase and headed out into the night. And if there was a spring in his step in anticipation of seeing her again, Mithra did not mind at all. 36. What of the maid? She's lasted longer than most of them, and she seems a willing enough worker. Melisende had been about to enter the kitchen, but at the sound of Mithra's mother's voice, she waited a moment. She needed to hear this. The cook spoke next. "She works, yes, but she's not like any of the others we had before. This one has Crusader blood in her. Some Crusader's bastard, I'd wager, who'd never worked a day in her life before she came here. You wouldn't believe the things I had to show her how to do." Only because the cook wanted everything done in such a particular way, no one would have known what she wanted before she told them, Melisende fumed. She'd scolded Melisende for boiling water wrong. When Melisende had bottled more potions than this woman had made meals, despite being half her age. If it weren't for Mithra, she would have left this place a long time ago. Oh, and the army. If they'd left. Yes, that's what she'd meant. Crusader said she's the best maid she's ever had. She's helped her with her hair and gown more than any of the other girls. Like she was a lady's maid or something before. Maybe to some Crusader lady. If she's lost one position in a fine house, you can be sure she's got her eye out for another one. Lady of this one perhaps. You should find your son a wife as soon as possible, Banu. Before she seduces him. You know Crusader girls are neither modest or obedient. If I had a coin for every insolent look that girl has given me, I would be rich enough to pay someone to cook for me. Incredulous, not insolent. Melisende shook her head. Never mind. It wasn't like she needed a herbal infusion to help her sleep. She was tired enough most nights as it was. Tonight was no different. She'd barely laid her head upon her pillow and she was asleep. What felt like less than a moment later, she awoke again, to the sound of footsteps outside her room. Cassim was dead and buried, she told herself, as she rose as silently as she could and crept to the wall, where she'd hung up her clothes and her knife. Melisende? Are you in here? She let the sheath knife fall. Mithra was hardly a threat. Give me a moment to dress, she called, tugging a gown over her shift. At home she'd have needed to lace up the gown, but the shapeless garments that were the fashion here had no lacings at all. Probably a good thing, for she suspected Mithra would not know how to help her lace a gown. She stepped out into the passage, which was lit by a lantern at Mithra's feet. He must have just arrived home from his shop because she'd filled every lamp in the house more times than she could count, and that lantern wasn't one of them. "What do you need?" she asked briskly. At this late hour, it had to be something urgent. "I need to thank you for everything you've done that's changed my fortunes so much I can scarcely believe it's possible." "You woke me up to thank me?" "I didn't realize you'd be asleep so early. Or maybe I just didn't realize how late it was. I've been working so many hours in the shop." Melisende felt a rush of sympathy for him. It wasn't all that long ago that she'd struggled to learn a whole new occupation, and her body still hadn't adjusted to the workload. She summoned a smile as she took his hand. "Come, I'll make you a healing draught that will help you sleep, so you'll be well rested in the morning." In the kitchen? He didn't sound particularly eager to accept her offer. Of course. For all the size of this house and its outbuildings, there was no stillroom, so the kitchen it must be. "Just that my mother and the cook are talking about finding me a wife, and comparing the various virtues of all the local girls. If I go in there..." Suddenly, this shadowy hallway seemed the best place to be. "I don't need anything anyway. I had my supper at the shop while I was doing the day's figures. Then I decided it was time to celebrate, and I realized I had a promise to keep. To take her home. That had been weeks ago, and the army still showed no sign of leaving. Maybe she'd be a housemaid forever." Melisende shook her head. "I can't expect you to work miracles, Mithra. Without your help, I wouldn't have been safe for all these weeks. You found me food and lodging." Even if she did have to work for it, she thought but didn't say. It wasn't his fault he hadn't been born in a castle or grand house, with rooms to spare for as many guests as he liked. Well, now his father's house had that, but the soldiers still marched through the streets, so she could hardly proclaim her true identity yet. "Yes. Food. I finally remembered to get you a sesame cake." He held out something round, roughly the size of his palm. Now she needed her knife to cut a cake. Melisende wanted to laugh, but one look at his earnest expression and she didn't dare. Instead, she gingerly took the cake from him and bit into it. A cloyingly sweet sticky mass hit her tongue. A mass that proved surprisingly chewy, despite the gritty seeds that gave the cake its name. Finally, she managed to swallow. "What did you think?" he asked eagerly. "It's good," she managed to say. She ventured another bite. If anything, this time it tasted even sweeter, coating her mouth in stickiness. She'd need a drink after this. Would Mithra be offended if she went to draw a bucket of water from the well? "Here." As if guessing her thoughts, he held out his water bottle. Taking the leather flask in her free hand, she drank deeply before trying to hand it back. He waved it away. "Keep it until you're done. Peter's father used to buy us each one on special feast days. When I tried my first one, I stuck my head in the water barrel. Peter laughed so hard he spat cake everywhere." She held out what remained of the cake. "Then you should have some. Truly, I cannot eat another bite." She washed her hands while he finished it off. "Peter would have loved to meet you," he said. "I can't imagine what it must be like, to have so many memories of someone and then to have them plucked from your life, as if they'd never existed," Melisende said. She leaned in to kiss his cheek. "Thank you for sharing this with me." Maybe it was dark, or maybe she'd misjudged. Or maybe he'd turned his head at just the wrong moment, and that's why she missed. But the moment her mouth met his, time stopped. And it was more magical than anything she'd ever done in her life. Until his lips left hers. Only then did she realize that time had not stopped, though it had felt like it. Somehow she'd twined her arms around his neck and wound her legs around his waist. His hard body pinned her back to the wall, holding her up, while his hands were busy elsewhere. When he tangled his fingers in her hair, somehow her braid had come undone, the way the rest of her body wanted to. His other hand cupped her face as tenderly as if she was his most treasured possession. The look in his eyes said he wanted her to be. Then he set her down and stepped away, hanging his head. "Forgive me, Lady Melisende. I forgot myself. For a moment I thought I was better than I am. But it seems I am no better than my uncle, stealing what was never mine to take. Maybe I deserve the same fate." He turned on his heel and was gone. Melisende's knees did not have the strength to hold her, so she slid down the wall to sit on the floor instead. Her lips burned from his kiss, a kiss sweeter than any cake, which made her hunger for all manner of forbidden things. "Oh, Mithra. You can't steal a kiss when it's freely given. And after that you have only to ask, and I would give you 1,000,000 more. Much more." She squeezed her eyes shut. The cook was right, though Melisende had not known it until now. She did want to seduce Mithra. If the army did not depart soon, allowing her to leave, she'd do it too. For she knew she could not resist him. She laughed softly to herself. All her life, she'd laughed at the girls who flirted, trying to win the attention of whatever man they fancied. All it took was one kiss to turn her into the worst of them all. Reluctantly, she returned to her bed, expecting sleep to elude her. Instead, she fell instantly into a dream where Mithra returned with more kisses and caresses. When she woke the next morning, no amount of water could cool her burning blushes. 37. On the morrow, Mithra threw himself into his work once more. When he went to Rialto, he would offer to purchase Simon's shop from his family, and that would take more gold than he currently had. Unless he used the coins he'd taken from the thieves' cave. No. To do that would be to draw attention to the fact that someone other than Cassim knew the thieves' secret, and they would come after him and his family. And Melisende. Mithra buried his face in his hands at the thought of her. He'd come to her chamber last night to thank her, to give her a gift and tell her he had not forgotten his promise to help her. Instead, he'd behaved no better than his uncle, pinning her against the wall so that she could not escape while his mouth plundered hers, stealing kisses he did not deserve. She'd been so frozen with fear she hadn't even tried to fight back. He was as bad as his uncle, no better than the soldiers who'd stolen all those Crusader girls and used them for their own sordid pleasure. Why he'd forced this highborn lady into servitude. She cooked and scrubbed floors when he was the one who should be fetching things for her, serving her. He was a fool. While he might be a merchant now, he would not remain one for long if he didn't buy more goods to trade. He'd go back to being a penniless woodcutter, what he would always be. No match for a Crusader lady. He couldn't even meet his mother's eyes, knowing she wanted him to wed, when the only woman he wanted was one he could not have. So he worked, and one day he went back out the army camp and asked to see the general. He offered to buy all the remaining goods in the Crusaders' warehouses, and the general agreed. He sold Cassim's shop to the clothes merchant, shifted what little stock that remained to Simon's shop, and set off for the warehouse district. While he found many warehouses, Simon's included sadly, that had been plundered of everything they contained, others like the one Cassim had sold, were relatively untouched, and they contained a wealth far beyond what he'd paid to the general. Now he had an excuse not to return to the house until very late at night, leaving early every morning, consolidating all his trade goods in the warehouses with the stoutest doors, while he decided what to sell here and what to ship off to other markets, when the army left. And they would. They had to, for, faithless wretch that he was, he owed it to Melisende to take her home, like he'd promised. Then, and only then, would she be safe from him. 38. "Excuse me, but are you Master Mithra?" a little boy asked. Mithra looked up from his books. The urchin could have been him at that age. "I am," Mithra said. "Got a message for you, Master. Your father says to come home quick, because there's someone to see you. Some merchant from far away looking to trade. Says he did business with your uncle. One of Kassim's business contacts. The first he'd heard of, as Kassim hadn't kept records of who had sold him things. His father was right, he needed to meet this man. Thank you, he told the boy, tossing him a coin. The boy had bolted out of sight by the time Mithra made it out into the street, but it didn't matter. He knew the way home. The house was a blaze of lights, even the stables had the lanterns lit, and he could hear horses inside it for the first time in as long as he could remember. He stuck his head inside and exchanged nods with the two men tending the horses. He recognized them both as grooms who worked at one of the city's inns. Well, they had worked there, maybe they'd lost their jobs like his mother had. It appeared they had a new job now, more horses than Mithra thought would fit in this stable, but then he was no expert when it came to animals. Trees and trade were where his talents lay. And trade was what he wanted. He headed up to the house, where his father was no doubt entertaining their mysterious merchant guest in the dining chamber. Outside the door, he paused to listen to their conversation. You would not believe it, but we were a day's ride from anywhere, and out of the desert marched a line of mules, all roped together. I stepped up to take the lead animal's halter, and they all just stopped. I let out a shout to tell everyone they were safe and it was not a company of soldiers come to kill us all, and we soon had the fire lit again, with dinner back on the spit. I knew a horse dealer here in town, so I brought them to him today, hoping they'd fetch a fair price. But you know horse dealers, he tried to offer me far too little. So I said I'd sell them to my friend Kassim, a merchant I know who always needs more mules, and he'll give me a fair price. He always has in the past. There was no mention of any mules in Kassim's books, Mithra knew, for he'd been through them twice. Not even the mules he'd purchased on the day he died. Whoever this merchant was, he must be mistaken. So he said he'd take another look at them, and when he did, he said these were Kassim's mules, for he'd sold them to him just last week. Unless Kassim's ghost had been buying mules, someone was lying. Likely the horse dealer, for Mithra knew Simon had had bad dealings with him in the past. Approaching footsteps made him turn. It was just the cook, bringing a tray of food. Best that she didn't catch him lurking out here. Mithra entered the room. Father introduced his son to the merchant, Judah of Kerioth, a Christian, also Ali Baba said. The man certainly dressed like a crusader, but his name seemed familiar, while the man himself did not. Perhaps Simon or his uncle had mentioned him. Mithra accepted a cup of wine, watching as the cook refilled the merchant's cup. He drank far more than father, and seemed to be sweating excessively in the heat. A Christian in Doralium. It has been some months since we've seen one. Please tell me your secret. How did you manage to evade the Seljuk army? Mithra asked. For if this man could, then he could take Melisende home. What Seljuk army? I saw no such thing, though we had heard they were about. We had a terrible fright one night when a pack of mules came upon us in the dark. You will not believe me. The merchant began his tale again. Mithra considered stopping him, but instead he let his thoughts drift. Let the man get comfortable and enjoy their house's hospitality. A well-fed man would be well disposed to trade with Mithra, and for a favorable price. For whatever this merchant dealt in, if Mithra could find a way to sell it, he wanted to buy it all. At the best price, of course. On the morrow, when their deal was concluded, then he could tell Melisende the good news and begin planning their journey. 39. 2 of the lamps have gone out. Go and refill them all, the cook commanded, coming back to the kitchen with an empty tray. Melisende bit back a curse. I can't. I used the last of the lamp oil to fill the lamps in the guest chamber I've just finished preparing for the master's visitor. The cook's oath was not as quiet as Melisende's. Then her eyes lit up. The man's an oil merchant. He won't mind if you take some from one of his jars, there were dozens of them. Melisende frowned. Stealing from a guest goes against the laws of hospitality. Though she knew her culture and the cooks were very different, the laws of hospitality were universal. The cook waved away her worries. Not when the guest intends to sell that oil to the master. They'll bargain about the price over dinner, but by morning, those jars will belong to the master. Why else would he have brought them here instead of to an inn or his own warehouse? Melisende had no answer for her, so she grabbed a jug and headed out to the stables. She'd been tempted to offer to take care of the guests' horses herself and tell the cook to hire a maid for the night instead of grooms, but airing and washing linens was infinitely more preferable than shoveling horse shit, which was what the grooms would be doing come morning. So she'd held her tongue and nodded meekly, which had earned her a suspicious glance from the cook, but she'd managed the spring cleaning in her father's castle often enough to prepare a room on her own. Then, as now, her thoughts had wandered when doing such menial work, and today they'd flown outside the city gates, where this traveling merchant had come from. A Christian, the cook had said, which meant the army must be gone, or he'd found a way to sneak around them. Either way, it would be a simple matter for her to bundle up her meager belongings, and take the same route away from Doralium. She could go home. But not before she'd had a chance to bid farewell to Mithra. He usually returned home late, long after she'd retired for the night, so she hadn't seen him since the night they'd kissed, but tonight she'd wait. Besides, she had lamps to fill and who knew what other chores to keep her busy for a while. She swung open the stable door, marveling at the bustle of activity in the echoing empty space where she and Mithra had taken refuge during Cassim's imaginary illness. Horses occupied every stall, plus anywhere they'd found space to tether the extra beasts once the stalls were full. There was no sign of any oil or a vessel which might contain the stuff. Maybe in the tack room, Melisende thought as she pushed open the door. "Don't do that, miss, for the Zebani in there will surely trample you to death," a groom said, thrusting an arm between her and the open doorway. Melisende glimpsed a set of flying hooves, which made a thunderous clatter as they hit the floor. "See, miss? A creature comes straight from hell itself." "Surely not." Silver destriers were rare, and if they'd been closer to home, Melisende would have wagered every coin she had that this fearsome animal had come from her father's stable. The horse reared again, and she was certain of it. "Moonlight," she called softly. The gelding's ears pricked. Down went the hooves, and he lifted his nose to blow warm air across her outstretched hand. She waited a moment, then patted the horse's flank as her gaze swept the room. No oil jars here either. Something was amiss. Melisende just knew it. "Are all the horses like this one?" she asked. "No, miss, most are nice and calm. Happy to get something to eat. That one turns his nose up at everything and tries to trample anyone who approaches him. It's a wonder he let you near him." Not a wonder at all when you knew Moonlight and his twin brother Moonfire had learned to run alongside Melisende in the fields behind her father's castle. No, the wonder was how an oil merchant could afford a mount like Moonlight. "Show me the other horses," she commanded. The groom eyed her askance for a moment, before his shoulders drooped and he headed toward the stalls. "They're all just horses, miss." It was true, and yet it wasn't. Melisende knew more about northern horse stock than most men alive, and these were no common horses. Palfreys, most of them, with a couple more destriers, along with a handful she thought might be pack horses. In the last stall she had another surprise, a pale horse that could have been Moonlight's twin at first glance, but this one was younger. Likely born during that long, cold winter when the snow had stayed on the ground well into spring, and the mares had kept warm by letting the stallions cover them. How many colts had been born that spring? 3, 4? All named for the weather that year. Snow? Sleet, she tried. Ice? Then it came to her. Frost. The palfrey lifted his head over the stall door, ears pricked. Melisende rushed to stroke him too. No mere merchant could afford 2 of her father's horses. Why, even Mithra, with all the gold in the thieves' cave, might not have enough for 2 of them. These horses had belonged to knights or princes or noblemen with plenty of gold to spare. Men who had likely died on that battlefield. These were Crusaders' horses, all of them. Had this merchant bought them from the Seljuk army? But no. The army hadn't taken the horses, they'd already been stolen by the 40 thieves. Thieves would sell to a Christian merchant, Melisende told herself, but even that felt wrong. Surely thieves would know better than to sell horses of this caliber to be used as pack animals. She'd think on it later while she filled the lamps. Meanwhile, she still needed to find the oil. Where are the oil jars these horses were carrying? She asked, half expecting the groom to deny any knowledge of them. After all, these horses didn't look like they'd been carrying heavy loads for many miles. They didn't look like they'd carried anything heavy at all. We put those in the cellar, the groom said. He led her to the yard and pointed. Over there. The cellar where Kasim's body had lain during his imaginary illness, which still smelled faintly of corruption. Of course. She thanked the groom and marched toward the cellar. When she threw the doors open, she saw a curious sight. The promised oil jars were lined up along the walls, much like the golden statues in the thieves' cave. A jug hung from the neck of each, swaying a little in the air flow from the open door. She examined the first jug critically. It was made of cheap, thin clay, easily broken but able to hold a large quantity of oil. Suitable for lowering into the jar to scoop out a measure of oil, then pour it into her own sturdier vessel. She unfastened the lid so that she might lower the jug inside. Is it time yet? She almost jumped out of her skin as the voice seemed to come from nowhere. No, from inside the jar. Because we've been talking, Captain? Does this thief have any daughters or a comely young wife or 2? It doesn't seem right to kill them all and burn down the house when we might take the women with us to enjoy later. Murmurs of assent came from the other jars. The 40 thieves had not sold the horses. They were here. And if she didn't do something, they meant to leap from their jars and slaughter Mithra and his family, before burning this place to the ground. Not to mention what they might do to her. Her mind whirling with panic, she knew what she needed was time. Time to think, to get help, to decide what to do. So she lifted up her jug, speaking into it to make her voice deep enough to pass for a man's as she said, "We shall see. The house is heavily guarded, so we must wait until they are all asleep or the guards will stop us. Wait for my signal and I'll see you get the woman you deserve." None if she had any say in it, Melisende said to herself. When I tap on your jar 3 times, tap back so I know you understand, she added. She walked along the row of jars, tapping on them and hearing her signal echoed back from every one except the last. She tapped again but no sound came from it. Annoyed, she kicked the jar only to hear the slosh of liquid inside. So there was some oil after all. Melisende lifted off the lid and peered inside. An impossible idea kindled in her mind. 40. All the jugs sat on the table, brimful of oil and stoppered with a piece of rag that extended upward like a wisp of smoke. Smoke that would soon become flame. She took a deep breath. This was her last chance to back out, to change her plan and go summon the guards. To find enough people to keep the thieves from killing Mithra and his family. But if she left, the thieves might emerge early and begin their terrible task. These men had no mercy. She'd seen that when they killed the Horn Knight. They'd slaughter Mithra and take her as their plaything. No, she had to do this. She had no choice, for she was no man's toy. She took a torch from the wall and waved it across the tops of the jugs. 1, 2, then a dozen rags caught alight. She would need to be swift and sure, so fast that she'd finished before the first man had time to react. Melisende tugged on a pair of heavy leather gloves, hoping they would protect her. Even if they didn't, Better burned hands than these men getting their hands on her body. She bit down hard on her lip, tasting magic as time slowed. Melisende seized an armload of jugs and raced along the jars. Lift the lid, throw the jug in so that it smashed, spilling flaming oil onto the man inside, then onto the next one. More jugs. More lids. More breaking clay. Again and again. Until there were no jugs left. Melisende slumped against the table, reeling while she waited for the world to catch up to what she'd done. And then the men began to scream. She fled through the cellar door, barring it behind her before the horrible sounds reached the stables. She hoped no one in the house above heard. Finally, the cellar fell silent. Melisende counted to 100, then did it again, before daring to open the door. Nothing moved. She crept down the steps, wrinkling her nose at what smelled like burned bacon. By all that was holy, did cooked human flesh smell like bacon? No wonder Mithra's family never ate pork. The smell only strengthened as she ventured deeper into the cellar, ably assisted by the fact that some of the jars were still smoldering. Glad of the leather gloves she still wore, she set her hands on the rim of the nearest jar and peered inside. Smoke stung her eyes, but the man inside didn't move. Nor did the next or the next. She went around the whole room, checking until she was sure each jar held a corpse. Only then did she dare to breathe again. The 40 thieves were dead, and Mithra was safe. Melisende swallowed. She'd killed 40 men. Burned them alive. Her, the coward who'd run from the battlefield. She wished she could run now, run home and hide from this horrible thing she'd done. Instead, she crawled into a corner and cried. Moments passed, or maybe it was hours. She wasn't sure. What she did know was that she had no tears left. Not for the men she'd burned alive, or for the innocent girl she'd been before she'd slaughtered 40 men. But was it 40? Surely there'd been a sentry of some sort, and the captain they waited for. Melisende counted the jars. 38, 39, 40. Yes, she had killed 40 men. She counted the jars again. But this time, when she got to the last one, she peered into inky blackness, for it was still mostly full of oil. She'd killed 39 of the 40 thieves. Men who'd sworn vengeance on Mithra's family. If the last one found out what she'd done, it must be their captain, for that's who they'd expected to come for them. Their captain must be the merchant, sharing a meal with Mithra's father even now, before he'd retire to the guest chamber beside Mithra's room. Mithra, who worked so hard and slept so soundly he wouldn't know there was an assassin in his chamber until the thief struck. Numbly, Melisende drew a final jug of oil. She ascended the steps, jug held high, as she headed back to the house. She'd killed 39 men this night. What was one more? 41. Mithra almost choked on his wine when Melisende walked in with a tray of sweets. Judah's gaze was drawn to her, and she seemed to have eyes only for the merchant too. He was one of her people, Mithra told himself. The first she'd seen in weeks. Of course she'd stare because she knew what the man's presence meant as much as Mithra did. The army was gone and she could go home. She served his father first and then himself, despite Mithra's frantic gestures to serve their guest. Did she not know the most basic parts of the rules of hospitality? It seemed she did not. Next, she set her tray down and refilled their wine cups, once again neglecting Judah. "Serve our guest, girl," Ali Baba hissed. Melisende moved around the table, snatched up a bowl and held it out to Judah. Except something seemed to go wrong. She tripped or the bowl slipped, and instead of being set on the table before the man, it flew out of her hands and smacked into his chest, dribbling its contents down his tunic before clattering to the floor. Melisende uttered a muffled curse, then dropped to her knees to clean up the mess with a cloth. Judah glared down at her in fury. "You must forgive our new maid, Master Judah," Mithra said with a forced smile. She is still in training and only just beginning to learn how to serve at table. I'll send her back to the kitchen and…" Melisende had started to clean the man's tunic, dabbing at it with her cloth while muttering apologies. Judah clouted her across the head. "Do not touch me, girl." He lifted his head to meet Mithra's gaze. "Send the clumsy slut away. Ruining such costly silk. If she were my servant, I'd see her whipped." A line of red appeared across the merchant's throat, a line that began to rain, sheeting down his front and his already ruined tunic. His sentence ended in a choking sound as he pitched forward onto his plate. While his father gaped, Mithra's mind worked faster. "Melisende, how could you do such a thing to a guest? Have you never heard of the laws of hospitality? We shall be cursed forever for this." Melisende rose gracefully to her feet, and tossed a bloodied knife onto the table. The red jewels set in the gold hilt seemed to remind him of the hellish fires that surely awaited them all. "That man's no guest. He hasn't eaten or drunk a thing the whole time he's been here. Instead, he's been throwing it all on the floor beneath the table, see?" She lifted the cloth to reveal the mess Judah had made. "Perhaps the man is a messy eater. But that's no reason to kill him," Mithra said. "He was clutching that dagger down by his side, under the table. I've seen it before, it was in my bag, and I left it in the thieves' cave. He dropped it when I threw his food at him, and he hit me when I picked it up. He's no merchant, and I'd wager he's no Christian either. That tunic belonged to a knight I knew, who his men killed before dumping his body on the battlefield. This man is the captain of the 40 Thieves. He came here with his men to kill you all and burn your house down. If anyone has broken all the laws of hospitality, it's him." Fire blazed in her eyes. "If you don't believe me, go and look into the oil jars sitting in your cellar, and see what has become of his men." Then, to his father's shock, Melisende strode over to the sideboard and poured herself a cup of wine. "The Seljuk army is gone, and on the morrow I start my journey home." She raised the cup high. "To your health, and I hope a long life, though I will not be here to save you next time." She drank the cup dry, then threw it on the floor and stormed out. Mithra rose. "Father, we should see what is in the cellar." "You believe this ill-mannered maid?" Ali Baba sputtered. It took Mithra a moment to remember that what had sounded quite polite for Melisende might not seem so to someone who hadn't heard how colorful her vocabulary could be. "Father, she has saved my life several times, and if she says that the 40 Thieves are here to seek vengeance, then I fear that not only is she telling the truth, but I have done her a grave discourtesy." Mithra led the way outside, not caring if his father followed. The cellar still stank of corruption from Kasim's body, but it was stronger now, thick with the miasma of smoke and burned flesh. Mithra knew the stench of burning bodies, for he'd helped bring wood for more pyres than he cared to count. "I don't know how, but we both owe her our lives. 40 times over for the lives she has taken in our defense," Mithra said. Father looked into one of the jars, then ran back up the cellar steps, retching. Mithra followed him, his feet heavy with the new debt he now owed Melisende. Only to find the lady herself, standing in the yard. Mithra fell to his knees, then bowed until his forehead touched the dirt before her feet. "There is not enough gold in the world to repay you for the favor you have done for me, and for my family. Please tell me how you accomplished this miracle." She stared down at him for a long moment, then held out her hand to help him up. "Inside. Where I don't have to smell all those cooked pigs." Mithra could feel his father's eyes on him, but that didn't matter right now. All that mattered was Melisende. He followed her back to the dining room, poured her a cup of wine, and waited for her to tell her tale. 42. Her mouth was dry from talking so much, but she couldn't stop until she'd told it all. "I counted the corpses, realized there was one more man, perhaps the greatest danger of them all, so I came up to the house to find him. When I saw the dagger in his hand, I faltered for a moment, and that's when I spilled the sweets. Fortuitous, perhaps, because it gave me the opportunity to get close to him and do what needed to be done. Why was her cup dry? Surely she could not have drunk all that wine. Mithra lifted the wine jug, and she shook her head. Water, she said. She drank and drank, but still she could taste the smoke and ash of burned bodies. It had seemed so clear at the time, but now horror washed over her at the thought of how many men she'd killed. She could feel Ali Baba's eyes on her, watching everything. Whatever he thought of her, it could be no worse than what she thought of herself. Murderer of 40 men. Worse than that, why didn't she feel any guilt for what she'd done? It seems to me that we owe you everything. Our lives, our fortune, my son especially, Ali Baba began. For such a debt, I can refuse you nothing. Anything you ask of me, I shall give you. Your freedom, wealth, anything. Father. Melisende is not a slave, and the wealth of the 40 Thieves properly belongs to her. You cannot offer her what is hers already. Mithra protested. Ali Baba bowed his head. If my son, your most passionate defender, is correct, then I have little to offer. Except my son himself and my blessing upon your marriage. After all you have done, I would be honored to accept you as a daughter. Melisende stared at him. A moment ago he'd been glowering at her for misbehaving, and now he was offering his son to her like some sort of prize. Never mind that Mithra was a good man, the sort any girl would be happy to have as a husband. After that kiss the other day, Melisende could not deny she'd been entertaining thoughts of sharing his bed. Surely Ali Baba couldn't know about those thoughts. Mithra's laughter cut through her reverie. Father, that would be poor payment indeed. Lady Melisende is no maid, though she has pretended to be one for many weeks now, biding her time until she might go home. She is a Crusader lady, one who managed to escape from both the soldiers and the battle and hide in the forest, where I found her when I went out woodcutting. She saved me from the 40 Thieves whose treasure trove I'd unwittingly stumbled upon, so I offered to help her hide until she might go home. That is her true heart's desire. She has no wish to be here with us. She wants to go home, and I propose to escort her there safely as soon as possible. Ali Baba's face fell. But what of your shop? Melisende almost laughed at his abrupt shift in focus. Men and their business, always business came first. The shop is almost empty, with no goods left to sell. If this oil merchant had truly been what he said, then I might have had something, but as it is, I must travel to seek new goods I might trade or return here to sell. Since Simon's death, I have been planning a trip to Rialto, and now is the time to take it. I shall take Lady Melisende with me, so that I may see her safely home. Her heart sank. Home. The impossibly distant place she'd barely thought about in some time. She'd been so busy with her life here. We shall leave in 3 days, Mithra continued. That should be long enough to bury the bodies, seek supplies for the journey, and to source suitable clothes for Lady Melisende. Ali Baba nodded. Yes, we must bury the bodies. If anyone knew what had happened here, no, they must not find out. The jars we can bury too. But what of the horses? We take them with us, Melisende said. 2 of them were born in my father's stables, and the rest will be able to carry goods or fetch a fine price in my homeland. You have a fortune in horseflesh in your stable. More than most men make in a lifetime. But she'd have to go with him, to see that the horses sold at a proper price. Mithra didn't know horses the way she did. Once she was home she'd be happy again, Melisende told herself. She'd see everything she'd missed and wonder why she'd left in the first place. Doralium, the crusade, murdering all those men, it would all seem like a fast-fading dream. Yes, home was where she belonged. Not here. She rose. I shall retire. In the morning, we can begin our preparations for the journey. Mithra rose too, then bowed deeply. "As my lady wishes." "His lady." A dream and nothing more, she reminded herself, as she headed off to bed. 43. Rialto was like another world, where the sea crept into the city, in aquamarine streets, that Mithra had to remind himself he could not simply walk along. For what felt like the 1000th time that day, he glanced at Melisende, who appeared to be as entranced as he was. He breathed a sigh of relief. Rialto was new to her too then. But his eyes lingered on her, on the layers of linen that looked just like his own clothes, as modest as anything she'd worn in Doralium, and yet… It was because she didn't wear a veil, he told himself, but that wasn't true. She hadn't covered her face in the house, or in the stables. Then again, she'd rarely smiled in Doralium, but her lips seemed stuck in a permanent curve since they'd left. Her eyes lit up at the slightest thing, as she pointed to whatever had caught her interest to make sure he didn't miss it. Melisende was the most delightful traveling companion a man could ever meet. If he hadn't fallen in love with her in Doralium, he'd have done it again a dozen times over on the way to Rialto. It would break his heart when they parted. But what else could they do? She was a high-born Crusader lady, headed home to her father and likely marriage to some Crusader lord. He was a merchant, newly risen to the position, who had yet to prove himself outside of the Doralium market. He would focus first on finding Simon's family, and giving them the gold that belonged to them. Perhaps then they would be willing to do business with him, or introduce him to other Rialto merchants who might. A few inquiries about the Ziano family gave him the address of what he understood was the family patriarch's palace. It wasn't until he stood outside the grand edifice that put every single one of Doralium's finest houses to shame, that nerves began to knot in his belly. He was no one. He did not belong here. If he'd known how important Simon's family was, he would not have dared. "Ooh, Duke Sebastiano Ziano's house. My brother said wonderful things about him when he came home from Rialto. I always hoped I'd get to meet him." "What business do you have with him?" Melisende asked. She'd insisted upon accompanying him, and Mithra hadn't had the heart to refuse her. She knew more than anyone where he'd come from and how this was no place for a lowly woodcutter like him. But the Duke's servants might allow a Crusader lady inside. Plenty of people crowded into the Duke's reception hall, yet the servant made the crowd part to allow them through. No, to let Lady Melisende through, Mithra reminded himself. He trailed behind her, carrying the pitifully small chest. Lady Melisende of Marischal and Master Mithra of Doralium. Two people I never imagined I would get to meet, and yet, you are both here in my house. The man who greeted them looked like a much older version of Simon, with an open smile that said he meant every word. "You must stay with me while you are here in Rialto. I insist upon it." A few words to his servants, and he'd not only ordered refreshments for them, but guest rooms and instructions to bring their things from the ship. Finally, the Duke gestured for them to sit, as he took a seat for himself. "Lady Melisende, please forgive me if I seem insensitive to your beauty and the honor you do me in this visit, but your companion carries news of my brother that I have sorely craved for many months." The Duke's eyes turned to Mithra. "His letters are always full of news of you and his son, so I feel as if I know you, Master Mithra. My brother's last letter was full of his plans for returning to Rialto with his family, and leaving you to manage his business in Doralium as his partner. Yet here you are. Please, Master Mithra, what word do you bring of my brother Simon?" The eagerness in the Duke's eyes smote Mithra's heart. That Simon had had such plans he'd never shared with him, which might have saved Peter and all his family if he'd only left Doralium sooner. Haltingly, Mithra began, "Your Grace." "Sebastiano, please. Simon looked upon you like a son, which would make you near enough to my nephew." Mithra nodded. His heart had never felt so heavy. Why, if he fell in the canal outside, his heart alone would drag him to the bottom of the sea. Yet he'd sworn to do this, and he owed it to Simon. Simon, Peter, and all their family were killed by Seljuk soldiers. The army stormed Dorylium, slaughtered all the Christians, and claimed all their goods as their own. I was too late to save them, but I managed to keep the soldiers from looting the shop, and saved what I could from the warehouse. I asked myself what Master Simon would have done in my place, and I hope I was not wrong in opening his shop for business. I sold everything mostly to the soldiers themselves, and set the gold aside to return to his family when the Seljuk army had gone. He lifted the chest onto the Duke's desk and opened it so that the man might see the gold inside. It was a small chest, true, but it was full of gold coins. I have since inherited my uncle's shop, and I had hoped to buy Simon's shop too. Now he has no use for it. He stopped when he saw the Duke. Sebastiano buried his face in his hands, openly weeping for the brother he'd lost. It is as I feared. Simon should have left Dorylium long ago, I told him. But he would not listen. And now all that is left of him and his family is a cold box of coins. He closed the lid and fastened it with a click. Then he pushed the box toward Mithra. You are a good man and an honest merchant, to have brought this here to me. But I am the Duke of Rialto, and you have come from a Seljuk city. I cannot accept any gifts from you, nor any gold. Nor can I trade with you while your city and mine are at war. All I can offer you is what is lost to me, everything my brother owned in Dorylium. His house, his shop, any goods that remained, they are yours now, just as Simon intended. Mithra jumped to his feet. But I cannot. The Duke held up his hand. You must. For who else is more worthy of my brother's worldly goods than his only surviving son? I know you have a father, who I pray still lives, but one day, like Simon, you will wish to marry, and what if it goes against your father's wishes? Simon always followed his heart, like I did, and he would want you to do the same. With this gift, Simon would have set you free from all familial demands, and granted you the wealth to marry whatever girl you wished. I will gladly do what he could not. Not whatever girl he wished, Mithra told himself, not daring to look at the woman beside him. The one who would always hold his heart. Mithra mumbled his acceptance, and was greeted with a grateful smile from the Duke. A moment later, Mithra was forgotten as the Duke turned to Melisende. What news of your brother? He asked eagerly. My brother? Sir Godfrey, of course. You must have good news of his quest. Is that not why he has sent you? For the first time since he'd met Melisende, she did not seem to know what to say. 44. My brother was safe at home the last time I saw him. I have not seen him since the Crusaders left our village. The last I heard, he was in Bizes. But that was months ago. Your Grace knows more about his movements than me if you have seen him since then, Melisende said. The Duke's face fell. So he hasn't found my daughter yet? Godfrey had been searching for the killers of some girl he'd found, Melisende remembered. The Duke's daughter could not have been in her village at home. Could she? When did your daughter go missing, Your Grace? Was it before the Crusaders left? He shook his head. No, some months after that. They'd already left Bizes, your brother said, when he kidnapped her. No, Godfrey would never do such a thing. You believe my brother kidnapped your daughter? Unless this daughter was the reason he'd come home from Rialto in disgrace. There must be more to it though, for Godfrey would never do something so dishonorable. The Duke burst out laughing. Lady Melisende, you and I both know Sir Godfrey would find it easier to fly than to kidnap a virtuous maiden. No, it was some rogue magician with his terrible arcane arts, he said, who stole my poor Penelope. Godfrey swore he'd go after them and bring her back. Why would Godfrey steal her when your father and I wanted him to marry her? I won't deny your brother isn't the brightest lad, but he's not as stupid as that. Melisende breathed a sigh of relief. The dead girl wasn't the Duke's daughter, and her brother had evidently made amends for whatever crime he'd committed on his first trip to Rialto. While she had her doubts about her brother's ability to bring the girl back, if he found her at all, she didn't dare say so in front of the Duke. Instead she said, "My brother may not have the sharpest wit, but what he lacks in quickness he makes up for with loyalty and honor and willingness to do whatever is necessary. If anyone can find Lady Penelope, it will be Sir Godfrey." Even if it took him 20 years, Melisende thought but did not say. "I hope she is soon returned to you, Your Grace." "Yes." He stared at her for a moment, then clapped his hands. "But in her absence, you must join me for dinner. Both of you. I insist." Before either of them could protest, Melisende and Mithra were herded off by the Duke's servants to a pair of adjacent and very opulent guest chambers, where suitable clothes had already been laid out. Melisende stared at the gown, made of so much silk she'd rustle like a tree in a high wind at the slightest movement. There would be no running for her tonight. "Would you like a hot bath, my lady?" a maid asked. Melisende could not recall the last time she'd known such a luxury. "Oh yes," she said. 45. Mithra arrived in the dining room to find only the Duke there. He felt a little less self-conscious in his borrowed finery when he realized the Duke was dressed almost the same. They talked of small things at first, the weather and the way prices changed when one was at war, before the Duke moved to more serious matters, like when the war might end. "Because I'm eager to get back to all the long-standing business arrangements in your city, and those surrounding it. Wars are bad for business, as everyone knows. Once it's over, we can pick up where we left off, if that is amenable to you. Simon said you knew his business better than he did, and he had contacts everywhere. If I wanted silk, he had 6 men he could source it from, and another dozen if they did not arrive in time. Once this crusade is complete, you may expect the arrival of one of my sons, for I regret I am too old for such journeys myself." The Duke fell silent as his attention shifted elsewhere. Mithra followed the man's gaze, and the vision that captivated his own gaze was brilliant enough to leave him gasping for breath. "She's like an angel, isn't she? The Baron of Marischal always was one to breed the most beautiful creatures, but he'd never part with one of the mares. I tried to get her for one of my sons, fair begged him I did, but he'd hear none of it. Not even when I offered to marry her myself. Duchess of Rialto, highest lady in the land, was not good enough for little Lady Melisende. No amount of money would persuade her father to part with her. That's why I agreed to the marriage between his son and my daughter. If only the Seljuks and then the Crusaders hadn't ruined all our plans, eh, Master Mithra?" But Mithra could not speak. He could only watch as Melisende floated into the room in a cloud of gold silk, which somehow showed every delicious curve of her body even as it covered it in the most modest way possible. She wore a matching veil so gossamer thin that her hair caught the light through it, gleaming as she turned her head. "My daughter Penelope made that dress. She wore it to a wedding once, and I think the only man with eyes for the poor bride was the groom. Seeing it on Lady Melisende makes me want to lock her away in the strongest room of the palace, with all the other priceless treasures, so no man could steal her. Do you not agree?" "Lock Melisende away?" Mithra recoiled. No man who'd seen her face light up with every breath of wind or shaft of sunlight, or watched her climb a tree, or run as though she would fly faster than the wind itself, or laugh as a bird alighted on the mast to eat a meal of fresh-caught fish, no man who'd seen her glorious soul shine out through her eyes could even think of committing such a crime against her. Maybe Melisende's father was right to keep her away from such a man. Melisende frowned and flicked at her skirt. For all its beauty, the gown restricted her steps, making her mince across the floor instead of the swift strides that came so naturally to her. "No, Your Grace. All I want to do is set her free from everything that confines her." The Duke stared at him for a moment, before he began to nod. "Ah yes. You're a young man in your prime. Of course, betting a naked angel like that would be bliss indeed. Horrified that the Duke had taken his words in a way he had not meant them, Mithra opened his mouth to explain. But Melisende was now close enough to touch, as well as hear every word, so he fell silent as she dropped a graceful curtsy. Mithra's eyes nearly popped out of his skull as the slight tilt of her body let him see right down the front of her gown to the most perfect pair of breasts. He closed his eyes. He would treasure that vision until his dying day. "Your Grace, Master Mithra," she said. "Where is everyone else?" Sebastiano beamed. "We are everyone, my dear. I have no desire to share you." An angry sound came out of Mithra's throat before he could stop it. The Duke added smoothly, "Except maybe with Master Mithra here, of course." Melisende's smile sparkled like diamonds in the sun. Did he imagine it, or was she looking only at him? "You must forgive Master Mithra if he is a little surprised to see me," she began. "For in Doralium, you see, the women are not allowed to dine with the men. Dinners in Doralium must be dull indeed, for I cannot imagine wishing to deny myself a moment with the beauty that is before me now," the Duke said. "How dare this old man try to seduce her?" "That is precisely the problem," Mithra said. "You see, when a man is so beguiled by a woman's beauty, he may forget to eat or drink or speak to his companions at all. Now that is a dull dinner indeed." Melisende laughed merrily, but the Duke did not join in. 46. By the end of the meal, Melisende could scarcely keep her eyes open. She had a vague idea that, as the highest-ranking person there, the Duke had to dismiss them before she could retire to bed, but if he didn't do it soon, she was going to fall asleep on the table. Finally, the Duke rose. "Lady Melisende, forgive me for keeping you up so late. It is rare that I have such fascinating company at dinner. You must allow me to take you for a tour of Rialto on the morrow." Melisende bobbed a curtsy, not caring how graceful it appeared as long as she didn't fall over. "Your Grace is too kind." Since Godfrey got home from Rialto, for months he talked about the beauty of the churches here, and the exquisite artwork. I confess I have been terribly envious of him for quite some time. The Duke bowed. "Then on the morrow, your envy will be at an end. And tonight, should you wish to confess and absolve yourself of such a terrible sin, I will see that the priest in my private chapel is available to you." She opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again as she realized it had been many months since her last confession, and she would be wise to accept the Duke's generous offer. So she muttered something she hoped sounded grateful and headed up to her room. She found Mithra a step behind her. Oh, of course, his room was beside hers. "May I speak to you for a moment?" he asked. "Privately?" "Of course," she said, following him into his room. His bed was enormous, just like hers, and seemed to dominate the room. It would definitely dominate her dreams tonight too, for Mithra was never far from her thoughts. Melisende chose a chair as far from the bed as possible. "What do you wish to discuss?" she asked. "What do you intend to confess?" he demanded. She stared at him. He was not a Christian, but he'd lived with one, so surely he knew about the sanctity of the confessional. Though it was possible that he did not. "My deepest, darkest secrets, so that I may be forgiven," she said. Mithra shook his head. "You cannot tell this priest about the 40 Thieves, or their cave, or what happened to them. If anyone were to find out, they would arrest us both and kill us for our crimes." "What can I tell him then?" Melisende demanded. "Maybe that you ran off on a crusade. Surely you regret running away from your family." She thought for a moment, longer and harder than she thought she'd need to, but still the answer was the same. "I do not regret it for a moment. The church encouraged this crusade, so the priest would praise me for it, instead of calling it a sin. And I am of age, entitled to run away from my family if and when I desire. Perhaps not wise to do so, but I did it, and I refuse to regret it. There must be something. There was, and she would probably regret saying it aloud, but it would serve him right for being so obstinate about this. She could confess to whatever she pleased, and no man could stop her. She rose and met his gaze. Yes. For some weeks now, I have regretted one thing. Not the crusade, not my time in Doralium, and not any of the things I did there. Except the night the 40 thieves came. You cannot tell him. I don't regret killing them. They were criminals, and I did what was right to protect the man I loved. Maybe if I were a better, kinder person, I would feel guilt for the lives I ended. But the truth is that I did not. I still don't. If you had seen the things they'd done. Melisende took a deep breath. I regret that I did not tell your father the truth that night. When he offered me anything I desired, and you said you would take me home, I wish I'd had the courage to say what I wanted. Whether it could be mine or not. I regret not saying what was in my heart. She looked up to find Mithra staring at her. He'd done that plenty over dinner, but this time it was different. He stepped forward and grasped her hands. My father's debt is mine as much as his. Anything you want, if it is within my power, I would give it to you. You have but to name it, Lady Melisende, and it is yours. She didn't want to look at him, and yet she could not tear her eyes away. Tears blurred her vision. You. I wanted, for one brilliant moment, I wanted to marry you. But I am a lowly woodcutter, a man your father would scarcely notice. You've had marriage offers from dukes that he's refused. He would never agree to let me marry you. My father can go play hide the sausage with the duke, or the devil himself if he desires, but I'll have none of them. In Doralium it might be different, but here I am of age, which makes me the mistress of my own destiny. If I wish to marry a penniless young woodcutter, I will. Or if I want to marry a good, kind, wonderful man, whose first thought when he stumbles across a priceless treasure is to help other people, whose kisses burn hotter than the desert sands in the sun, then I would damn anyone to hell who dares to object. Then the fire in her died at the thought of the one man who might object, as he had that night, and silence her on this matter forever. Melisende. He was going to tell her he didn't love her, wasn't he? It would break her heart, but she would bear it. She must bear it. At least she'd found the courage to confess her feelings to him. To know he did not share them. How do weddings among your people work? When she looked up startled to meet his eyes again, he continued, You see, it's simple back home. The couple simply sleep together for a night under the same roof, and they're considered married. Crusader is now considered my father's second wife, seeing as she lives with him, even though he only shares a bed with my mother. So if it's just a matter of sharing my bed, I'd happily take you as my wife tonight. Her mouth was dry. Why was her mouth so dry? That burning look in his eyes. It seemed to set some sort of fire inside her. The very thought of his hands, his lips on her skin. The bedding, that bit comes after the wedding, she managed to say. The wedding is where we make promises in front of a priest. The idea seemed to come to them both at once. The Duke said there was a priest at your service in his private chapel. Do you think? Melisende grabbed his hand and strode toward the chapel. 47. Promises said in front of a priest took almost no time at all, and then Mithra had Melisende back in his chamber. By her people's customs, she was his wife. But by his, she would not be truly his wife until she'd cried out his name in joy. Right. Now was not the time to tell her he'd never bedded a woman before. There were 1,001 ways to pleasure a woman, he told himself. If he could remember merely a few of them, it would be enough. He prayed he would be enough. Melisende stood staring at the bed with her back to him, her silk gown glimmering in the candlelight. No cave of treasure had ever tempted him half as much as she did right now. He stepped up behind her, pressing her body against his, as he bent his head to kiss her throat. His fingers worked on the lacings that bound her gown so tightly about her body. On each side and again at the back. She shivered in his arms. "You have no need to fear me, Melisende. I swear I will never hurt you. Whatever those soldiers did to you, I will not." She twisted in his arms so that she faced him. "No soldier has ever touched me. You're the only man who has, and we stopped before you could." She blushed. "You're a virgin still?" He scarcely believed it. Wordlessly, she nodded. Untouched. How had he not guessed? "I promise I will never hurt you." He'd have to be so careful. But with someone so precious, how could he not be? He would start slow. Carefully, Mithra leaned in for a kiss. Oh, but he'd forgotten how one kiss with her could set the world on fire. "Mithra, oh my God, Mithra." He blinked. As if this was their first kiss all over again, somehow he'd backed her up against the wall with her legs up around his waist, but this time his fingers were inside her, circling and stroking as her irresistible heat contracted around them. She threw her head back and screamed his name again. "You said you'd take me to bed after 3 times. That's 7, Mithra. Please," she begged. 7. He'd pleasured her 7 times already? Only 994 to go. He undid the final set of lacings, and gold silk slid down her body to puddle on the floor. The next layer was white silk, laced up the front so tightly that her breasts seemed ready to burst out the top. He gave the hem of her shift the slightest tug, and 2 perfect pink nipples peeked out. All the ways he could pleasure her by caressing her breasts popped into his mind. He longed to try them all. But he wanted to take her to bed too. 3 more, he said, touching his tongue to one of those exquisite pink pearls. 48. Naked as her name day, her heart still thrumming in her chest from the blindingly perfect pleasure her husband had already given her, more times than she could count, Melisende knew she could not put off that fateful moment any longer. If she did, her courage might fail her. So she lay down on the bed, propped up by an obscene number of pillows, and said, "Please, Mithra, make me your wife." Then she closed her eyes and prayed he would be swift, like her sisters-in-law had told her their first times had been. She heard the swish of fabric, Mithra undressing she had no doubt, and considered peeking, but the ladies had advised against it. If her husband was large, the sight of him would likely frighten her, and if he was small, well, men were sensitive about their man parts, so she'd been warned not to say anything about them at all. She felt the pillows beside her shift as her husband's weight settled upon them, instead of on her as she expected. Strong hands seized her, lifting her as easily as if she were one of the feather pillows and not a flesh-and-blood woman. He set her down on his lap, straddling him as though he expected her to ride him like some sort of horse. But the heat of him between her thighs was like no horse. It made her yearn to feel his touch there again, a mixture of hardness and heat that almost made her swoon. She grabbed his shoulders to steady herself, her hands closing on even more hot, hard flesh. Melisende's eyes flew open, and for the first time she saw her husband naked. His arms, shoulders and chest were just as muscular as she remembered, when she'd pushed him up against that tree. She wanted to run her hands along every ridge, touch her tongue to every dimple, to kiss. He wore nothing but a lazy grin as he met her gaze. "I know not what you've heard about Crusader husbands, but marriage among my people is a very different thing. It is up to a wife to take a husband, and if I do not please you, you can divorce me by simply saying so. So, will you take me, Lady Melisende, and wed your body to mine?" His fingers stole between her legs again, stroking slowly. She opened for him, like a flower who could not resist the sun. "Yes, oh yes." And then he glided into her, burning her with the most glorious heat, as his hands closed around her hips once more and ground her against him. Her sisters-in-law had talked of pain, but Melisende felt nothing but pleasure and the burning desire for more. "Oh God, yes," she cried. "Oh my God, Mithra, do that again." Within moments they found a rhythm, their bodies rising and falling as one, until waves of pleasure rolled over Melisende and she screamed for joy at the top of her lungs. And again and again and again, until they lay together, spent. "Do I please you, Lady Melisende?" Mithra asked as he stroked her breasts. She wanted him to take one of her nipples in his mouth, and do that thing with his tongue. "Oh my God, yes," Melisende said. "Well enough to be allowed to share your bed for another night?" "Every night for the rest of my life. And every day too," she said dreamily. Mithra chuckled. "Good. For there are 1,001 ways to pleasure a woman, and I don't think I've tried more than a dozen so far. If I have my wish, I intend to spend each and every night showing you all the ways I remember. Should I forget any, I know I shall have you to remind me, for it is my hope that every night we share shall be branded into your memory, as every moment we have spent together already is branded into mine. You have saved my life and my family and my fortune. Now you hold my heart, and I will spend the rest of my life showing you how grateful I am for it." She wanted to reply with equal eloquence, but he touched his tongue to her nipple and all coherent words left her with only a rapturous moan in response. Some hours later, after they'd made love for the third time and her joyous screams had likely woken half the city, she laid her head on his chest and said sleepily, "When we return home to Doralium, I want you to buy me as big a bed as this one, where we can make love every night." "And every morning," he replied, wrapping his arms around her. She lifted her head, eyes widening. "We can do it again in the morning?" "I understand it is the sweetest way to start the day." "Wake me at dawn then, so we can find out together." Her eyes drifted shut. "I will." This has been Still 40 Thieves Retold. A tale in the romance, a medieval fairy tale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.